Well, welcome everyone. It's a great honor for me to welcome you here this evening. My name is David Weinstein, and I'm the Executive Director of the Program for Economic Research. PER's main functions are to foster economic research and teaching at Columbia and project ideas from academia into the policy and business world. As such, PER aims to bring policy and business leaders to Columbia in an effort to foster interactions with our academic community. One of the great things about Columbia is the close tie between the business school and the economics department. Today's event would not have been possible without the support of Glenn Hubbard, who is not only Dean of the Business School, but also a member of my department. In addition, I want to give special thanks to Sunil Gulati of the Economics Department and Olivia Albrecht and Bruce Kogut of the Bernstein Center at the Business School for their part in bringing today's event to fruition. This event is part of a broader program at PER to improve our understanding of financial markets. Over the past 5 years, PER and the Business School have brought together a series of major players in the financial policy world, ranging from 2 New York Fed presidents, Timothy Geithner and Bill Dudley, to architects of foreign financial restructurings in other countries, such as Heizo Takenaka from Japan and Howard Davies from the UK. Today, we are particularly fortunate to have a speaker with us who needs no introduction. Henry Paulson served as U.S. Treasury Secretary from 2006 to 2009 and helped oversee the U.S. government's response to the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. As many of you know, Secretary Paulson's first speech after being sworn in as Treasury Secretary was here in this room as part of a Business School speaker series. Prior to serving at Treasury, Henry Paulson capped a 32-year career at Goldman Sachs by serving as its chairman and CEO for 7 years. Last year, Secretary Paulson published a book, On the Brink, detailing his experience at Treasury during the global financial crisis. The financial crisis is an event that indicates both how far our understanding of economics has come and also how far we still need to go. The good news is that our policies seem to have averted another Great Depression. It is hard to understate what a triumph that is. At the time of the Great Depression, we had only primitive theories of what role could be played by monetary, fiscal, and financial policy. Officials had very little sense of whether the right response was fiscal stimulus or contraction, whether bank failures mattered for the real economy, or whether the Fed should tighten or loosen monetary policy in recessions. That ignorance of economics cost us dearly. Keynes changed all of this with powerful theories of fiscal and monetary policy, but left open questions about the determination of inflation and the role of financial markets. Today, the cutting edge of economic research is being done by economists trying to understand the interplay between financial markets and macro policy. Indeed, this is a major initiative for PER and perhaps a major reason why the recent financial crisis did not metastasize into another Great Depression. And yet, there are many who rightly criticize both economists and policymakers for not being able to predict, prevent, or smoothly manage financial crises. And as those engaged in the debate know, while criticism is easy, finding and implementing the solutions is very hard. And so, with the hope that we will hear some of the solutions tonight, I'm now going to turn the floor over to Glenn and Secretary Paulson. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, David, and Hank, welcome to Columbia. We're delighted to have you and Wendy with us this evening. I remember that when you were first going to Treasury, at times that to many people seemed like halcyon salad days, your questions were all about the things that actually came to bear, troubles in the financial system, the rot in the housing sector, and so on. So I just wanted to start, if I might, by taking the bull by the horns and take you through the crisis a little bit. Why did you decide not to bail out Lehman? when there's no setup here. When AIG comes so quickly thereafter.
Right. Well, first of all, I do appreciate the question because it's interesting that I think most people believe I have a reputation for telling the truth and would say the same thing about Ben Bernanke and Tim Geithner. And so despite the fact that all three of us have repeatedly said that we tried hard to prevent the failure and that we couldn't find a single authority that would have worked to prevent the failure, people tend not to believe us. Many people, and I think the reason they don't is because they look at Bear Stearns and they look at AIG and they look at Lehman and they say, what's the difference? And so what I will do, I will attempt to explain this. And then when I get done, I'm going to ask people to raise their hands and say how many people understood what I said and believed me. Because what we found ourselves with a whole set of emergency authorities to deal with banks and virtually none to deal with non-banks. And so when Bear Stearns faced what was largely a liquidity crisis, although it was, I think, partly a capital crisis and a liquidity crisis, what we found was that despite the fact that the Fed on a Friday morning said it would back up JP Morgan when they made a loan, that Bear Stearns was an investment bank. It would have unraveled, disintegrated if it had gone into the next week without a solution. And the Fed didn't have any authority to put in capital or to guarantee those liabilities, and neither did Treasury. And we got very fortunate because JP Morgan stepped in and they were able to guarantee the trading book during the pendency of the shareholder vote. So we had, and the Fed was able to help with liquidity and loan against a mortgage portfolio, but we had JP Morgan. And we spent a lot of time after that just saying there's got to be some authority somewhere. And we couldn't find it. And I actually made speeches where I talked about the problem well ahead of Lehman. Now, I'll go to AIG. AIG, when they unraveled after Lehman, the perception was by regulators and by the market, fortunately, that this was a liquidity problem at the holding company. And that the insurance companies were well capitalized and were stable and that they had independent credit ratings. And the market believed that. We had calls after the rescue from a number of people saying maybe we could buy them. But what the Fed was able to help with the liquidity problem by loaning against the insurance companies. And that worked until the situation worsened. People got inside, the rating agencies looked at them and said, you know what, we're going to downgrade them unless you put in capital. And then we had the TARP and we could put in capital. Now with Lehman, we had this liquidity and a capital problem, a much bigger capital hole than anyone else and a liquidity problem. And at the end of the day, we didn't have a buyer. So fortunately for us, Bank America bought Merrill. It would have been, we tried to get them to buy Lehman. They bought Merrill. If they bought Lehman, Merrill would have gone down and it would have been a bigger problem because they were a bigger firm. Barclays was interested, but the UK regulator wouldn't sign off on it. So the Fed could have made a loan, but to make a loan into a disintegrating company in the middle of a bank run would do nothing. They actually made loans as it was, after the bankruptcy against some of the collateral. So we just didn't have the authorities to deal with Lehman, and we didn't have the authority to wind down the institution outside of bankruptcy. So I don't believe any institution is too big to fail, but some are too big to liquidate quickly, as we found out with Lehman. So anyway, I will say after that, it's a rather long explanation, but how many people understood what I said? Okay, well, I'll take it.
Okay. And let me follow up, since you mentioned TARP and bailouts. Let's talk about bail-ins and bailouts. So you mentioned you lacked authority. What kind of resolution mechanism or authority do you wish you had as Treasury Secretary?
Well, first of all, I think we clearly needed authority to deal with any systemically important institution, whether it's a bank or a non-bank, to be able to step in to prevent a messy bankruptcy. And I think we needed the authority to wind them down over a period of time. And right now, although the Dodd-Frank isn't perfect, I think it does provide that authority. And I think that's the biggest thing that was missing. Now, we didn't have the kinds of emergency authorities you would have liked that you had with banks during that period, which is to guarantee liabilities, to stick in capital. So those are the kinds of authorities that would have made a real difference.
Well, on the bailout side, let's talk about TARP a little bit. TARP became a synonym in many people's view for just bad public policy, welfare.
Right.
On the other hand, many economists have been more favorably disposed in thinking about TARP. How do you think of TARP? Was it a success? How do you know? And why do you think it was so unpopular?
Well, okay, I would say looking at it today with 2020 hindsight, I believe that TARP is one of the most successful government programs of modern times because it prevented a collapse of the financial system. It worked, and then the banks came back much quicker than any of us at the time when we did this. When we designed it, if you told me the banks would have come back and be as healthy as they were, as quickly as they were, I would, that was terrific. And then, of course, the money's going to come back to the government with a profit. And so I structured it so that they were preferreds and that it would come back. So why is it so unpopular? And Glenn, when I left, I always tell the story because it puts it in perspective. When I left Treasury, I saw a poll where 93% of the people in the country were against the TARP and 60% were against torture. So that just tells you how really...
It says Michelle Bachmann is onto something, I think, in reading.
So how really unpopular it was. And I think it's unpopular for a lot of reasons. First of all, people don't like banks and bankers and bailouts, and thank God they don't like bailouts. And in our country, if someone takes risk and are going to reap the rewards of that, they're also supposed to reap the consequences. And I think the fact that we didn't have the right authorities to wind down institutions and have them fail when they should have failed, but we're forced to prop them up, because if we hadn't propped them up, the result would have been catastrophic for the American people, I think, is one reason. And then the other is it was and Barney Frank explained this to me very quickly the night I went up September 18th to get the TARP. When we went up to get the TARP, the system was on the brink of collapse. We'd stepped in at the last minute and figured out how to guarantee the money markets. Before we'd done that, major blue chip companies were having trouble rolling over the commercial paper. And so it would have very quickly spread to a situation where all kinds of companies, large, small, would have had to contract, shrink their inventories, not pay their suppliers, lay people off. It would have had a very horrendous situation. So we explained to Congress, to the leaders, that the arteries were frozen, and what had happened to date meant that the economy was going to really turn down a couple of months from now. But if we didn't do something, it was really going to be bad. And I remember Barney saying, "You won't get credit for a contrafactual." And I said, "What's a contrafactual?" And he said, "Hank, American people are never going to give you credit for preventing a disaster they never saw. You're going to do the TARP, the economy's going to turn down. People will say, you said we're going to do this to prevent us from stepping in deep doo-doo, and we are in deep doo-doo. You're not going to get credit for it. And I think most people don't understand how fundamental the financial system is to the economy and the backbone of the economy, and how catastrophic it would have been if the system had collapsed. We started to think about just what we would do if it went down. There was so much concentration. It took a long time to come back, even with just Lehman failing. So it was, but I don't think the American people understood that. So, and I think it's in many ways a good thing that we as a country don't like bailouts, and that hopefully there'll be wind down authorities in the future that can be used so that when someone fails, no one will be too big to fail, no institution. They can be liquidated over time, or certainly not propped up in their current form.
Well, let's talk about Barney Frank a minute, since you brought him up. You know, David, in his introductory remarks, had talked about the need in a crisis to work quickly. You know, it's not sufficient just to have an idea; you got to get it done. I would commend first everybody in the audience reading Hank's book, On the Brink. This is my Oprah Winfrey moment for you, Hank. But what's interesting, I read the hardback version so Hank could get the decent royalty from it. But the paperback version, which he sent me, has a foreword by Barney Frank. And I told him, I can't really imagine Barney Frank writing a foreword to a book that I had written. So I was delighted to see that Hank had done it. I wanted to ask him a question. What was it like in the middle of a crisis to know you had to step across the aisle to people who didn't necessarily share your views about the financial system, about regulation, and get something done? How did you do that? How did you approach it? Who were the heroes of that?
Glenn, I think if the crisis had occurred right after I arrived in Washington, we would have had a very different result. But I had a year before the crisis, and I had worked out an arrangement with George Bush where I wouldn't get involved in any political activities. I wouldn't participate in the elections, that I needed to be able to build relationships on both sides. And then I'd had an opportunity in advance, because I started, right after arriving, I saw the problems with Fannie or Freddie. And I started working with Barney on reform. And prior to that time, the White House hadn't been willing to compromise. And I thought actually the White House was right in terms of their policies. And I convinced the president that if we didn't compromise, we were going to leave with nothing. And half a loaf would be better than a full loaf. So I started working, and I got to know Barney. I had an opportunity to work with Nancy Pelosi on a stimulus bill, so I knew the Democrats pretty well and had an opportunity to work with them and build a relationship. And then, of course, in a crisis, Barney is very smart, and he understands politics and he understands markets, and no matter what your political views are, he's a patriot. And so I didn't have to spend a lot of time explaining to him how bad it was going to be if the system collapsed. And we had enough of a trust that I would have had a hard time surviving without Barney there, because he was very helpful in helping me understand the issues and for the political issues. Because in many ways, my book is a story of really the collision of markets with politics, because the crisis took place at probably the worst possible time, a couple of months before a national election. And so, as Rahm Emanuel said to me once when we were trying to work something out, he said, you know, you've got your marketplace, Hank, and we've got ours. And they both got to work, and we've got to compromise.
Okay, what does that experience teach us, do you think, about bipartisan problem solving today? We have a different set of problems, but a large set of problems facing the country. How can we get this done? How does the experience that you went through give us a roadmap for getting things done?
I don't think it does in the one sense. But one of the things I learned, but I'll try to be more positive, but one of the things I learned is it's difficult to get anything that is big and significant and controversial and difficult done unless there's a crisis. And so I was very fortunate that twice, right we're on the edge, that I went to Congress with Fannie or Freddie, and I always tell the story when I was talking to the political people, I said, there's so much debt outstanding, I need unlimited authorities. And they laughed and they said, you can never use that word. Why don't you? Then finally someone said, say unspecified. So I got unspecified authorities once just before it, and then the second time we got the TARP. But it took, so they didn't actually have to see the collapse, but we had to get right up to the edge. Now, I do believe that that I have a high regard for the people who work at Congress, because they hustle, they're working very hard, it's a very difficult job. But when you're in the House and you're on every 2 years, and you're talking about your job and the votes, and everyone that voted for the TARP knew they were making a very difficult political decision. So the only thing I can say that I learned, Glenn, was I didn't know there was going to be a crisis when I arrived. I thought we might have one, but I wanted to get some things done, and so I spent a lot of time up talking to Republicans and Democrats, listening to both sides, and recognizing that I wasn't going to be able to get anything done unless I was willing to compromise. But I certainly don't think I've got the roadmap to how to get how to deal with some of the major challenges we have to deal with short of a crisis.
Well, let me take you to one that showed up in the crisis too. It's interesting that despite the big regulatory reform we've seen, there really hasn't been serious reform of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac that you mentioned, which were at the vortex of the crisis. You have for years, both before you went into government and certainly as Treasury Secretary, been a voice for reform of the GSEs. What do you think about the new Treasury proposals for the GSEs? What would you do? What's the right way to change them?
Well, first of all, let's deal with the good news. I don't think there's any credible people on either side of the aisle today that are saying their present form, where they're nationalized and our whole mortgage market is essentially nationalized, is the right thing. I don't think anybody, at least I'm hearing anyone, argue that the way they were structured before, where you had the implicit guarantee and using that for private profit and these huge portfolios and no capital and very light regulation made sense. So I believe that first of all, you need to look at this in light of overall housing policy. You know, you've got the mortgage interest rate deduction, you've got the FHA, you've got the federal home loan banks, you've got various state programs, and we've certainly overstimulated housing. I think that, you know, the administration put out 3 proposals, so they didn't advocate one. And I think even optimists recognize that there's going to take a lot of work and a lot of effort, and there's going to be a whole lot of political opposition to going with any one of those ideas they put forward. But one of them is essentially to just wind these institutions down and have the FHA programs, scale those back to deal with responsibly with lower income people. I think that's a reasonable approach. Another approach that's not unreasonable, but which is going to be very hard to implement, is something I had looked at as a compromise, which is having the government charge, first of all, to really shrink their mission, begin by limiting the size of mortgages where they can be involved, but then have them pay the government for the guarantee fee. And of course, if you charge enough for that, as you scale it out, then you'll take them out of the market altogether. It'll be there for the private sector. And the administration has put that forward and said, well, then they'll be there if there's a crisis. So the fee will be such that they'll only come into play if there's a crisis and the private sector can't do it. Now, you were in the administration when you dealt with TRIA, right? The terrorist reinsurance. And I think that shows you how hard it is when you have a government incentive and say we're going to phase it out. because it's very hard to phase it out. So I think that's going to be very, very hard to phase out. So I've argued and said, despite the fact I might phase them out altogether. I think that's going to be politically very difficult to do. And so if you end up with an explicit guarantee and they're paying for it and they're still playing a meaningful role, then I would make them utilities, because I certainly wouldn't have there be government guarantee for private profit. And I would have it be a utility. I certainly wouldn't have portfolios, and I'd have big capital rules. But I think you're very wise to point that out, this situation, because we needed to nationalize them. I think actually the most significant thing we did when I was there, was to nationalize those, because can you imagine what would happen to housing prices if we hadn't had housing finance? And I know you and I talked about that a number of times. So you need that, but right now, how we get the government out of that business and come up with some system that's sustainable is going to be very difficult to do. And I tell you, there should be even more focus on it. It's got to be done.
No, I couldn't agree more. I actually wanted to take you to something a little bit away from the crisis, following up on something you said about things you wanted to get done. I remember from the time you were going in that near the top of that list was your interest in China.
Right.
And in the administration, you were a leader, the prime leader really, in strategic dialogue with China. Tell us a bit about why that was such a top issue for you and what we should be doing now to engage China.
Well, the reason the U.S. relationship with China and the economic relationship with China was so important, as far as I was concerned, I thought this was as important as any bilateral relationship we had, any relationship we had in the world. And I believe it's always difficult to get things done unilaterally. And if you look at the world today, and when I went down there, that any foreign policy, national security, economic issue was going to be much easier if you had the biggest developed and developing country in the world agreeing, and much more difficult if you didn't, number one. And I also knew that the good news was we had an economic relationship with China. The bad news was whenever you have an economic relationship and a trading relationship, there's going to be tension. And we were going to have real tension if we didn't figure out how to get in there and manage that. And we sure did with the Japanese in the late 80s and early 90s. And so I am a big believer in engagement. And I think because we engaged and took a lot of time and built trust at the interpersonal level, that we were able to do things. We were able to get the biggest appreciation we'd had in the renminbi, which I thought was important during a relatively short period of time. We were able to deal with some food safety and product safety issues rather than having people shout at each other, deal with them constructively. And I thought it was very helpful also during the crisis. So I'm a big believer in engagement. I'm a big believer in negotiating very hard. I think that that what I emphasized all the time to my friends in China, I believe in open markets and trade, and I believe we benefit a great deal in this country. But it's going to be a lot easier for me to fight to keep our markets open to them if they kept making progress and opening their markets to us. I pressed them hard on currency because I thought it was in their best interest as well as ours, and it was a real sign of reform. And they were going to find it increasingly difficult to manage this complex economy without a market-determined currency, because in many ways China is an anomaly. You know, they are. I get questions all the time. Are they going to overtake the U.S.? Do we have to be afraid of China? You know, and they've got roughly an economy around 5 trillion, and ours is around 14. But our GDP per capita is just a multiple of theirs. they're around 7,000, and they're like rank number 100. So here you've got this country that's really a developing country when you look at GDP per capita, and then in terms of the size, it's integrated into the global economy in a very big way in terms of trading in goods and services. So no one would care if they had a non-market determined currency if they were just a little developing country with a GDP of $7,000 per capita. So I think how this relationship is managed is very important. I point out to people all the time that are worried about China overtaking the U.S. I think they're worried about the wrong thing. That China's got a lot of problems they're going to have to deal with. And trust me, our problems that we have to deal with are fewer than China's, and they're of our own making, and we have to solve them ourselves. And if China has problems and economic problems, all of our problems are going to be harder to solve. They really are. And so we have some things we need to do, and then we need to negotiate very hard with China, and like you always have to do when you have an economic relationship with others.
Let me follow up on this, the China problem and the U.S. problem, because on the China side, one issue I think of great concern to many in markets is the state of the Chinese financial system,
right,
banking system, and the problem of non-performing loans and state-directed credit. What should China do to reform in its interest? Forget us. Think about China. What's the key financial system problem?
Well, first of all, on the positive side, and again, you're talking to someone who was deeply involved, because before coming to Treasury, I worked on the first privatizations for telecommunications, for an oil company, and for Bank of China, and then worked with ICBC, the biggest bank. So, and what hits me about China is those banks were, when you look at what's happened to reform, where 10 years ago they had one regulator, for all financial institutions. They've created separate regulators, and when you look at what's happened to the institutions where they are insolvent, and they frankly were the vehicle they used to stimulate their economy. So where our banking system helped bring it down, theirs was a vehicle to help pull us out of the problem. Now there's no doubt they've got NPLs. That's not I think the rate at which the economy is growing and the rate at which those banks are earning, that's not the biggest issue. They got a lot they need to do, but I think what they need to do in China is develop capital markets that are efficient, good capital markets, so they don't have all the risk in the banks. If you look at the Chinese banks, they're the ones that are fueling the growth, and their loans are growing at 17% a year. And that's just too much, and that's why it's got to be a high priority to develop a corporate bond market in China. And they need their financial markets. I fought all the time to get them to open the markets for competition. And I used all kinds of examples. One thing I talked about a lot with my Chinese friends were the huge imbalances we had, which in my judgment don't come primarily from the currency. They come from structural differences. The fact that we have incentives and policies in the U.S. to cause us to spend too much and not save enough, and the Chinese also have policies that cause them to oversave because they don't have the social safety nets, social security system, healthcare system. Well, now they've taken the rate up for bank depositors now, and I'm not sure where it is right now. It's up in the high twos probably, but a number of months ago it was 2%, and inflation was a multiple of that. And the Chinese, people from all over the world are looking to invest in China because the economy is growing so quickly. The poor Chinese savers, are forced. They've got so few alternatives. They put money in the bank accounts. They get 2%. Can you imagine what it would be if they were getting 6, 7, or 8, or had had the kinds of opportunities that we have in this country to invest in 401k plans or whatever. And so that was used to incent to really prop up the banks, and then the banks were making lower cost loans to their export industries. But so reform in China, financial reform, really to open up the capital markets, and will do a lot to also take some of the pressure off the banks.
Now let's turn to the maybe harder subject, which is our problems, as opposed to China's. You mentioned helpfully that China and the U.S. are like a coin with two sides. China's over-saving, not enough emphasis on domestic demand. The U.S., on the other hand, has a saving problem and definitely a fiscal budget problem. You said earlier, too, that crises are almost required for real solutions. And of course, we have what many economists would say is a crisis. We have an unsustainability in our fiscal policy, but it is not a train wreck that will happen this year or next. How do we seriously address the fiscal challenges facing this country?
Well, I will do my best to answer your question, but I should also say to people, read your book, because I thought that the way you described it in your book was in simple, easy to understand prose, and I didn't read anything there I disagreed with. But
this is a very wise man.
Well, but the way I look at it is, we and a good number of Western democracies, although we may have stabilized the financial system, and we certainly have, and it's a lot safer, we haven't really dealt with structural issues. And many of the Western democracies, the voters want benefits they don't want to pay for. And politicians are therefore unwilling to tell the truth and to really come up with hard solutions. Now, I look at the fiscal crisis as just a huge fundamental problem we as a nation faces. And it's about generational equity. All of us want our kids or our grandchildren to grow up and have the same kind of opportunities we have, and we do a lot of things to help them. But we're a selfish people, because this generation doesn't seem to be willing to make sacrifices, and it's the next generation that's going to really pay for this if we don't do it. And as a matter of fact, it may be coming faster than the next generation, because you can't find anywhere in history a nation that lost its fiscal flexibility, its creditworthiness, and continued to be a great nation. Now, the good news is today we are by far the richest country in the world, and so I thought one of the most positive things in terms of, other than your book, but in terms of the fiscal crisis, was the Bowles-Simpson Commission, because and this was a bipartisan group that made some very, I think, a very good set of recommendations. But what they showed was you could do things in a variety of areas, and it would require sacrifices throughout our society, but none of the sacrifices would be too severe if they were spread around and you could deal with the problem. And of course, the longer you wait, the more severe those sacrifices would be. So I think what it takes to solve the problem is, first of all, and I think everyone knows this, there's the entitlement system, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, that has to be fixed, and that's huge. But another big part of it, and that had received a lot of focus before the Bowles-Simpson Commission, but Bowles-Simpson, I think, also really shone a light on tax reform. And because, again, as I look at taxes, and that we all need taxes, and we need revenues. And we can argue about what percentage of the GDP they should be, whether it's 18, 19, 20% or whatever. But then, to me, the interesting debate is not that, or not what rate those that make more than $250,000 should pay. The interesting question is what form of taxes will let us raise the revenues we need to raise and still be competitive and create jobs in the global marketplace. And here we don't come close to having the right tax system. And the Bowles-Simpson threw out some ideas, simpler things to do. They're not simple politically, but to get rid of most of the deductions and credits and sort of the biases in the system and just lower the rate and simplify. You could do that. You could move to a consumption tax. There are a lot of things you could do that are better, but it's going to take the simple answer to your question is the longer we wait. I have no doubt we'll solve this. We will because we'll have to. But the longer we wait, the more painful it will be, and the fewer options we'll have, and the bigger the cost the next generation will pay.
Now, I want to turn it over in just a second to the next generation in the audience, but I do want to ask you one final question about leadership. Because before you became Secretary of the Treasury, you were a respected CEO of Goldman Sachs. So what are the lessons comparing private sector leadership and public sector leadership? What do they have in common, but what are differences?
Glenn, there are, start and say, I think the skills that it takes to be a successful leader in the private sector are almost identical to what it takes to be a successful leader in the public sector. The skills, but the mindset is very, very different. And when I ran Goldman Sachs, I used to say to people, you can have the best ideas in the world, but if you can't convince others they're good ideas, they're worthless. You got to sell others. And of course, when you get to government, that is really true because it's much more difficult to lead in government. Much more difficult, much more cumbersome, difficult to get things done, and you really need to convince others. You know, as a Treasury Secretary, the only authority you have is what the president essentially gives you. The regulators are independent. And so to the extent you lead, you either have to convince Congress or others, regulators or others, that you're convincing them, you're trying to get things done where you feel a sense of responsibility, but you don't have the direct authority. So it's bringing people together, convincing them. Now, when I became CEO of Goldman Sachs, I had 24 years of working with clients. And so I'd worked with a lot of CEOs, and I had been able to see what were sort of the common attributes of leadership. And I had felt that the best CEOs were those that didn't lead by fiat, but that sold others in their organizations and outside, and developed a buy-in. I had felt very strongly that the good leaders everybody's got weaknesses, and every strength is a flip side of a weakness. You know, Hank can be candid, Hank can be indiscreet, Hank can be decisive, he's not thoughtful enough, or whatever. And so what you need to do is understand your weaknesses, get people around you that complement. And so good leaders had good people around them. I said good leaders defined their job expansively, they ran to problems rather than running away. Those are all the same things in government, but to me, what helped me as much as anything in government was having a year there early on. You worked for George Bush, I worked for him. I had worked out an agreement with the president that I would be the primary advisor and spokesman in all domestic and international economic issues. I was smart enough to know that wasn't worth a single thing if I didn't have a good relationship with him. Because if I didn't, it would be my fault and not his. So fortunately, I think when good CEOs come to government and fail, it's because they've been king too long, that they don't have the mindset to compromise. They don't recognize that the members of Congress are their clients or that they're working for a president. And fortunately, when I ran Goldman Sachs, I had advised a lot of clients and they were the principal. So I knew I had to build that relationship of trust. I knew that members of Congress, I had to work with them. And then of course, in a crisis, as was mentioned earlier, it's just a very difficult. You never have all the information you need or you like, and so you have to get as much as quickly as you can, and you have to weigh the costs of taking imperfect actions against the costs of not acting. And then you always have to be prepared to change. If you either learn more or the situation changes. And so it's just it's a different, and I think that's the same in the private sector and in government. And fortunately, I'd been in situations where I had to be decisive and make decisions, so I was used to making decisions. But you can't make a decision unless your boss is going to let you.
Okay, why don't we open it up for questions? There are microphones. Just two things to ask, one to be brief and two that it's a question. Sir.
Hi. So when I was hearing your answer to the first question regarding the difference between the companies you bailed out and didn't, I have to wonder, what if it were Goldman Sachs, a company you had a huge personal interest in, that were being bailed out? How did you, I guess, mitigate the huge conflict of interest that you had?
Well, as Treasury Secretary, I had an interest in and a responsibility for doing things that benefited the whole system and saved the whole system. And so I had very clear ethics rules that not to do anything that was Goldman Sachs specific. So everything I did related to the system. And so, for instance, when capital was put in Goldman Sachs, I designed with Fatima Treasury the capital program, made the decision that we were going to go out very broadly, but I had the regulators. The New York Fed picked the 9 companies and they picked it with a rationale that the systemically important institutions, and they decided how much capital each was going to take and so on, and that was done systemically. And there was a time when there was a concern that either Morgan Stanley or Goldman Sachs might fail, and that was between the time we'd gone up to get the TARP and when it had passed. And I did not want to get involved if there was something that was Goldman Sachs specific. And then I had my fellow regulators say, how could you be a Treasury Secretary and sitting here, and if the whole system would collapse and we go into another Great Depression and not be involved? So then I got a waiver to my ethics agreement if I had to be involved, but fortunately the situation never presented itself, so we never did something that was Goldman Sachs specific. So it's an interesting thing when you leave. When I left Goldman Sachs, I left Goldman Sachs. I sold my Goldman Sachs stock. I severed the relationship totally. I'm now the Treasury Secretary of the United States, and I've got one responsibility, and that's to the American people. And it certainly wouldn't have been upholding my responsibility to the American people if I didn't do everything I could to prevent the collapse of the financial system.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi. What do you think was the best decision you made as a Treasury Secretary?
Well, I would say we made I will tell you one, which was after, I've said to a number of people, I clearly felt that if we hadn't got the authority and then been brave enough to really essentially take over and nationalize Fannie or Freddie and stabilize that, if that hadn't been done before Lehman went down, it would have been it would have been, the problems would have been unimaginable. But I believe probably the narrowest we came, the closest we came to disaster, so I will call this the best decision, was in the week where Lehman failed on a Sunday night, which was September 14th, Monday was the 15th. AIG was going down on the 16th. The Fed came in and made the loan, which worked. And then what happened was, it wasn't just the reserve fund. We heard from multiple money market funds that they were going to have to put a restriction on redemptions, which would have just been there was $3.8 trillion in money market funds, and over 30 million Americans, and many of which sort of thought that was money good, like savings accounts. And those funds were used to fund commercial paper. And if that had gone down, I think I don't know how we would have put things back together. We would have had an incredible collapse. And it was really at the last minute we came up with the idea of the Exchange Stabilization Fund to do a guarantee. And I told people to work that out, and we announced it immediately, because announcing the guarantee is what the market, I thought that might make a difference. And I remember we did it so quickly, and I had people saying to me, Hank, we haven't had time to think about this. What about the unintended consequences? And I said, yeah, they're probably pretty bad, but I know what they're going to be if we don't do it. And so we did it, and then someone who I have great respect for, Sheila Bair, who chairs the FDIC, called me the next morning and said, Hank, why didn't you talk to me? I said, we didn't have time. And she said, you realize now all the money's going to run from the bank accounts to the money market. I said, good point, Sheila. We huddled very quickly, and we had the guarantee be effective the 19th of September. So only the money that was in the money markets as of September 19th. But that's how fast we were moving at that time.
Yes.
I was hoping you could comment on what happened with AIG, and at what point do the taxpayers need to bear the risk and the expense, and at what part do other parties and counterparties that were involved need to bear more of the risk and more of the expense of the failure and sort of the mess that came of that?
Well, I would say this about AIG. The AIG was a Fed action with Fed authorities, and one which I very much supported. Now, the Fed stepping in prevented just a huge disaster. When you look at the size of AIG and the complexity relative to a Lehman Brothers, the Fed didn't have the wind down authorities, so they had either the ability to make the loan or bankruptcy, because as I said, we didn't get those until Dodd-Frank. I'd say the other thing is, if you believe all the numbers and everything you're reading in the papers and I'm hearing, the taxpayer won't bear the cost. This will be a significant profit for the taxpayer. So it will have prevented a disaster and been a big profit for the taxpayer, quite a big one. But in terms of the way the Fed dealt with individual counterparties, I can't comment on that. That was handled by the Fed. But as I said, this was, I think, quite a successful rescue, and the taxpayer will be rewarded for the risk in two ways: one, avoiding a failure, and second, getting the money back with a profit.
Sir.
Since you've had a lot of experience dealing with fiscal crises, I was wondering if you could comment on these peripheral European nations and their relationship to the euro, and how the Central European nations can handle that, and whether they'll be continuing to be willing to do it.
What did I didn't hear that.
The peripheral European
Peripheral
nations.
Europe crisis,
Oh, yeah,
Greece.
Oh yeah, that, okay, so here's the way I look at this. I think everyone knows, and you don't need me, you're a bright audience, to say in many ways it's an odd construct. I remember the whole euro, having a single monetary policy and a single currency, and then having a variety of independent governments and political systems. And so I remember when that was set up, I was saying to people I thought it was an unnatural act, but I recognize it's very important to the Europeans and to those that remember what it was like beforehand, despite the imperfections. Remember what it was like beforehand, where we had separate currencies, and you beggar thy neighbor policies with currencies and speculators taking down one currency after another. So I think, first of all, when you look at the euro, you can't underestimate how the Europeans that have lived through both systems, how committed I think they are to the euro, number one. Number two, the financial system in Europe is not come back as quickly as in the US. I don't think their programs are quite as effective. I don't think their accounting is as transparent. I don't think their institutions were as quick as recognizing their losses, and they have lower amounts of capital. But the financial system is basically stable in Europe. And so what you're dealing with are the structural issues, the fiscal issue. And so the way I think about it is, I think in the short term, right now, I would guess that they have the commitment to do what's necessary to stabilize and prevent short-term crises, and they've got the financial capacity to do that. So I think the more interesting and difficult question is going to be how the structural issues are worked through later. And just as we've got problems with our deficit, there are going to be other countries that, Greece being one, there are a number of meaningful challenges in the intermediate to long term. But I think they've got what it takes in the short term, and clearly I understand that it's more difficult if you don't have your own monetary policy and your own currency to deal with some of the fiscal challenges when you're part of the euro. But I think for all those that are projecting the end of the euro or the demise of it, I don't see that. I see the euro being with us for a good while.
Okay, we've got time for one more question, then I'm going to give Hank the last word.
My question is both for Glenn and Hank. I have a question about the role of university faculty in economic regulation. So when medical researchers receive funding from pharmaceutical companies, they have to disclose these sorts of conflicts of interest. But when you're talking about economic regulation, there isn't the same institutions established. I'm wondering where the academic world is moving toward that and government agencies moving toward that.
So the question is, you want my views on financial regulation?
Conflict of academics being involved in regulation, conflicts.
Let me tell you, in terms of academics being involved in regulation, I don't see that as a significant conflict, because people know what they're, people know they're academics, and people know what they're, when it relates to financial regulation. And in terms of the medical regulation, I'll defer to Glenn.
Okay. Well, why don't we give you the last word? We've covered a lot of territory here, from Frank talk to talk about Barney Frank and everything in between. Any last word you want to leave us with?
I guess what I would just say to this group, and I was I visited a class earlier today, and I was thinking about what the world was like when I graduated from college in 1968 and from business school in 1970. And I looked at the sorts of things that in almost every industry people did, and it was not nearly as interesting as it is today. The opportunities out there are just tremendous, and they really are. And I find it when again, I'm going to show a bias. We've got huge problems in our education system primary and secondary schools in the U.S., but as someone who visited schools all around the world and hired from the best schools everywhere, I think there's just nothing like the top liberal arts schools, top business schools in the U.S. So I know you've got a great education, and there's just a real opportunity for you out there, and I'm very encouraged and very excited for you. And I guess the only other thing I would say to you is say something about work-life balance, because maybe people don't talk about that enough in school. But I had, particularly in my last career, I worked with many CEOs, many CFOs. I watched them during their careers, watched them retire. I worked with many people that didn't get as far as they wanted to in their career. And I know of no one who had a great professional career that retired and said, you know, if I've screwed up my family life, I don't have a lot of friends, but I had a great career and I'm happy. And I know plenty of people that didn't get quite where they wanted to get, but were able to find balance in their life, and they're quite content. And of course, in today's world, balancing that work-life balance is particularly difficult. When I graduated in the 70s, if you were an investment banker or a consultant, you worked really hard, and you had to worry about work-life balance. In many careers, you didn't have to. Now, just about everywhere, you've really got to work hard. And so what I say to people all the time when I'm giving younger people advice, I'm very enthusiastic about their careers, but I say take some percentage of the time, whether it's 10% of the time you spend planning and engineering your career, thinking about your life away from the office, with your family, with your extracurricular pursuits and so on. And to me, that's always been critical. And it wasn't easy. I tend to be a pretty intense person. And my wife sitting in the front row, and we were laughing the other night about a situation because we've got grandchildren now this age, and I still read with a monotone. And she was talking about the days when our kids were 2 and 4 years old, and I was working hard, coming home late, and Wendy said to me, Hank, you have to spend more time helping with the kids, and if you don't start coming home and helping her, you know, you're going to come home and I'm going to be gone and the kids are still going to be here. And so, and so I went to my boss and I got permission to take the 4:42 train home. I would get home and I would read him a good night story, put him to bed, and then get on the phone and work. And I'll try to rush through that story. So if any of you have ever heard me read a speech, it's not a pleasant experience. I just don't read with expression. And so I'd be going through this in the great green room with a red balloon, good night moon, you know, very quickly. And Wendy came in and said, slow down, read with expression. And as soon as I did that, both kids started crying and saying, no, read like a daddy, not like a mommy, you know. So I had trained them, but you couldn't leave one word or one sentence out. But I had to force myself early, but you get out of anything what you invest in it. And so we always found, whether it was working together at the Nature Conservancy or spending time with the kids, enough to do outside of your career. And so I told people, I once said something like this when I was speaking at a business school graduation, and I had another investment banker saying, Paulson, you hypocrite. You know, you're saying this and look at how hard you work people at Goldman Sachs. And I said, wait a minute, I don't think you can ask the company to manage someone's life. You know, if you're willing to work 80 hours a week, who's going to stop you? Or they'll say, why don't you work 85? So you have to, I think everyone has to figure out how to find that balance and how to do something that they can do well enough and naturally enough that they don't have to just be a drone. And so again, I would just say you're going to have great careers. The world's a dynamic place, but also work on your personal life also and find that balance, and I know you will. If you spend the time, if it's important, guess what? If something's important enough to someone, then they make sure that it works, and you just make sure you've got the right priorities. And with that, thank you all very much, and good luck.
Thanks. Please join me in thanking Secretary Paulson. Thank you. That was great. That was great.